tweets aren't policy, but they still get you in trouble. App Photoge. David R.K. Donald Trump's commitment to avoiding the antagonization of Russian officials on Twitter, a courtesy he reserves for no one else, was conspicuous months ago. Despite his reported fondness for those who return fire and engage their critics in public fora, Trump seems determined to turn the other cheek when it comes to Russia. This week, Moscow's efforts to provoke and agitate the president finally succeeded. And yet, rather than take his aggravation out on the Kremlin, he vomited his frustrations out all over Congress. The remarks by the Russian Prime Minister following Trump's decision to sign into law new sanctions on Moscow, backed by veto-proof majorities in Congress, represents the most melodramatic attempt to force the president to lose his cool yet. The U.S. establishment fully outwitted Trump, wrote Vladimir Putin's Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev. The Trump administration has shown its total weakness by handing over executive power to Congress in the most humiliating way. This isn't the first occasion in which operatives linked to the Kremlin used language seemingly intentionally calibrated to generate an emotional response from the American president, but it was the most successful. But rather than defend his honor against Russian slights, Trump essentially confirmed the accuracy of Medvedev's taunt. Our relationship with Russia is at an all-time very dangerous low, the president wrote. You can thank Congress, the same people that can't even give us HK. Compounding the cognitive dissonance in Trump's broadside against Congress was the fact that Vice President Mike Pence read this tweet amid his tour of some of the most threatened former Soviet republics. Russia seeks to redraw international borders by force, undermine democracies of sovereign nations and divide the free nations of Europe, Pence said after a meeting with the leaders of the 3 Baltic states. A strong and united NATO is more necessary today than at any point since the collapse of communism a quarter-century ago, and no threat looms larger in the Baltic states than the specter of aggression from your unpredictable neighbor to the east. Pence declined to address the threat to the peace in Europe posed by Congress. Trump deserves some credit for finally acknowledging that Russo-American relations have deteriorated to a dangerous point, but only very little. The Russian reset Trump hoped to engineer the third consecutive attempt at rapprochement with Moscow was over before it truly began. The president has made every effort to avoid the fact that Moscow's geopolitical interests conflict with those of the United States. Trump insulted the nation he leads in February when he made a bizarre attempt to strike a moral equivalence between the government of the United States and the murderous cabal in the Kremlin, but those conciliatory words were never followed on with action. By the time Moscow briefly closed the deconfliction hotline in Syria to protest Trump's April airstrikes on Russia's vassal in Damascus, the third Russian reset was already dead. Washington's move deals a significant blow to the Russia-US relations, which are already in a deplorable shape, said Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov. Russia appeared to hold out some hope that Trump may yet be useful, but he was not. Institutional pressures inside the United States and the structure of its alliances abroad prevented Donald Trump from offering Russia any major concessions, with the glaring exception of giving up on anti-Assad rebels in Syria, thrusting them into the arms of more radical militias. The sanctions relief Moscow anticipated never materialized. Its diplomatic facilities, shuttered by Barack Obama following Russia's intervention in the 2016 election, remain closed. American armed forces continue to stream back into Europe, reinforcing NATO's increasingly tense frontier. The Republican Congress decision to strip the president of the authority to administer Russian sanctions has less to do with a fear of Trump's policies than it does an acknowledgement of the president's inexplicable refusal to call Russia the threat that it is when he's not reading from a teleprompter. The Trump administration is now compelled by law to demonstrate that Russian behavior has changed before lifting sanctions imposed on Moscow after its invasion of Ukraine, but the White House has always said it would not lift those sanctions absent total Russian withdrawal. The administration has angered Moscow by greenlighting the sale of liquid natural gas to Russian clients in Eastern and Central Europe, and they have committed to providing Poland with anti-ballistic missile technology over the Kremlin's objections. It's Trump's actions as much as Congress that are aggravating Moscow. It's Trump's unfailing rhetorical support for Moscow that rendered him untrustworthy. Surely, Robert Mueller's probe into potential misdeeds involving the Trump campaign, the Trump Organization, and Russia have left the president feeling cornered. Moreover, no president would allow Congress to steal power away from the White House without protest. But, taken as a whole, the Trump administration's Russia policy isn't as controversial as are the president's reckless tweets. Maybe lawmakers and the public wouldn't be so concerned about Trump's relationship with Russia if he just kept his mouth shut. Iraq's economic rebirth. When American journalists and policymakers talk about Iraq, their focus is overwhelmingly on security. Will Iraqi forces mop up the remnants of the Islamic State? Will Iran extend and formalize its influence in Iraq? As the Iranian and Iraqi Defense Ministries' recent Memorandum of Understanding suggests, will the Hashd-Shabi, the largely Shiite militias that arose in the wake of Mosul's fall, remain a corollary to the Kurdish Peshmerga, or will they instead become an Iraqi version of Hezbollah? Will the Iraqi government and Sunni Arabs reach an understanding, or is Iraq destined for more sectarian violence? While the answers to these questions are crucial to Iraq's stability, so, too, is Iraq's economy. Iraq has for decades been the prototypical rentier state. The bureaucracy grew bloated and inefficient as new generations of university graduates entered government or took positions with state-owned enterprises. That was fine so long as the price of oil was inflated. Civil servant jobs may have been non-productive, but they both kept disenfranchised youth off the street. They ensured that a large proportion of the Iraqi people remained dependent upon the government for their livelihood and, therefore, acquiescent if not loyal to Saddam. Culture also plays into the bureaucratic bloat. Throughout the Middle East, family elders don't just push their sons and daughters into certain more prestigious fields of study. They also encourage them to accept civil service jobs with the promise of lifelong tenure rather than try their luck in the private sector. Over time, this trend has exacerbated rentierism in Iraq and other oil-rich Arab states as governments become ever more dependent on oil to pay civil service salaries while the non-oil tax base remains moribund. Iraqi Prime Minister Haider, however, seems intent to change that. Anyone who has met Abadi cannot help but be impressed with his technocratic grasp of the economy. He and his aides have been working behind the scenes to reduce the size of government. Privately, many Iraqi politicians and officials acknowledge that each ministry could likely function with one-tenth of its current staff, although for political reasons it will take years to trim them down to anything near that size. Abadi is advancing the reform issue smartly, however. Rather than simply fire people, he is seeking to reduce the impediments to private sector growth. On August 1, for example, the Prime Minister's office announced that the cabinet had approved Social Security for private sector employees, effectively allowing them the same pensions that public sector employees receive. It's going to take more than a single decision to make Iraq thrive, but, despite the heavy costs incurred fighting the Islamic State and growing criminality in Basra, Iraq's economy has been booming. This latest move should prolong the economic expansion. Indeed, for all Western lobbyists sing the praises of Iraqi Kurdistan's economic boom, when it comes time to put their money where their mouths are, international investors favor Baghdad over Erbil because Iraq has more financial discipline and corruption, as bad as it is not intertwined with ruling families. Populists will resist, of course, and progress may stumble, but Iraq's leadership is making economic and strategic decisions that will repair Iraq's financial base. Let us hope for the sake of regional security, Iraqi prosperity, and trade, that US and European policymakers, as well as regional states regardless of their sect, will do what they can to encourage such progress. Can Rex Tillerson fix its State Department? Among the many stories of internecine battles within the Trump administration is the supposed discord between the White House and the State Department. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is reportedly frustrated with White House vetoes of his staff picks, the encroachment of Trump aides and family in the traditional business of diplomacy, and resents Trump's unprofessional attacks on colleagues. Critics both inside and outside the State Department have questioned his leadership style and judgment, and some foreign policy watchers have speculated that Tillerson may be the weakest Secretary of State ever. Others have written about growing State Department dysfunction, as well as Tillerson's brusqueness and incompetence. The State Department may be broken, but, even if Tillerson's tenure has highlighted its problems, the dysfunction in the State Department is deep-seated and extends well before Trump's antics and Tillerson's questionable management style. Secretary of State Colin Powell's Chief of Staff Lawrence Wilkerson, for example, was a conspiracy theorist who has peddled in anti-Semitic dog whistles and has since found himself on the academic board of the Ron Paul Institute. In hindsight, while Deputy Secretary of State Richard Armitage proved himself a serial leaker in efforts to win bureaucratic battles against the Pentagon, the sustenance for many of the more outlandish conspiracies appears to have come from Wilkerson. A whiff of corruption surrounds Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's State Department because of the Clinton Foundation and the diplomatic favors which foreign states apparently believed they could receive if they made a donation. But, beyond that, Clinton appeared to base her decisions about when and where to travel on personal vanity rather than strategic necessity. Secretary of State John Kerry took dubious travel to an extreme. His trip to Antarctica, a region that has no diplomats with whom to engage, was tourism on the public dime, plain and simple. To suggest he needed to spend millions of taxpayer dollars and bring an entourage with him to talk about climate change with scientists with whom he could simply have initiated a Skype connection suggests mismanagement in his head office and the complete breakdown of internal controls. Clinton and Kerry, like Tillerson, also surrounded himself with a small and largely impenetrable coterie of aides. Critics are right that Tillerson has not distinguished himself in his new post. Promised State Department reform is nowhere in sight, morale is low, and American diplomacy has been largely ineffective. But, ineffective diplomacy is a broader problem and a reflection of a State Department which offers little direction or incentive for diplomats to be on the same page and to work toward a common goal. In the last half-century, the State Department has never conducted a lesson-learned exercise to determine how and why its most high-profile diplomacy with rogue regimes has gone awry. Its key leaders fail to recognize that continuing dialogue is not always the means to the end, and that compromise is not always a solution. Yes, critics are right, Tillerson's State Department is broken. But, if the State Department is to be fixed, it's important to acknowledge that a succession of secretaries from both parties presided over its decline. Immigration for Mar-a-Lago, not for the photo. Mel Evans file on Wednesday. The Trump administration made a big show of support for a radical immigration bill sponsored by Republican Sens. Tom Cotton and David Perdue. One part of the legislation makes a lot of sense. The other doesn't. The part that is sensible would transition America's immigration system from favoring family reunification to favoring a skills-based test for entry. That is the model that Canada uses, and it has worked very well in boosting that country's population and economy. As Jonathan Tepperman, the managing editor of Foreign Affairs and a Canadian expatriate, pointed out, while immigrants are a boost to America, they are an even bigger boost to Canada. About half of all Canadian immigrants arrive with a college degree, while the figure in the United States is just 27%, he wrote. Immigrant children in Canadian schools read at the same level as the native-born, while the gap is huge in the United States. Canadian immigrants are almost 20% more likely to own their own homes and 7% less likely to live in poverty than their American equivalents. If all that the Cotton-Perdue bill did was to adopt the Canadian model for the U.S., it would be a cause for celebration. But along with this sensible revision of the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, it also includes a plan to reduce overall immigration by half within a decade. It would stop 85% of family-based arrivals while keeping constant, at roughly 140,000 per year, the number of immigrants allowed in based on job skills. This makes no sense. As James Pethokoukis of the American Enterprise Institute argued, the U.S. economy would benefit from more, not less, immigration, as long as it's skills-based. Younger, harder-working immigrants are, in fact, essential to prevent a demographic implosion, similar to those now occurring in Europe, China, Japan, South Korea and other countries, where an ever-shrinking workforce cannot support an ever-growing number of baby boomer retirees. A survey of economists found that 89% strongly agree that the average U.S. citizen would be better off if a larger number of highly educated foreign workers were legally allowed to immigrate to the U.S. each year. As Pethokoukis noted, immigrant scientists and entrepreneurs play a disproportionate role in driving the technological advances that power productivity growth in the United States. He writes that roughly half of U.S. stock-based unicorns, technology startups worth at least $1 billion, were founded by immigrants, with India the top nation of origin. What about claims that more immigration hurts lower-income Americans? That was the case advanced at the White House by Stephen Miller, a nativist who previously worked for then Senator Jeff Sessions and now for President Trump. Miller was one of the driving forces behind the ill-conceived ban on arrivals from 7 Muslim nations that caused chaos at the nation's airports in January. Now he is pushing for a massive 50% reduction in immigration. When pressed by Glenn Thrush of The New York Times to cite evidence in support of his contention that immigration hurts the working class, African Americans and Latinos in particular, Miller fell back on discredited studies claiming that newcomers exacerbate income inequality. In fact, as Philip Bump observed in The Washington Post, the effects of immigration on income inequality are modest. A recent study by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine found that immigrants aren't taking American jobs, save for those held by teenagers who don't finish high school. By contrast, this comprehensive study found that high school immigrants spur innovation and boost the overall economy. There is, in short, plenty of justification for moving to a skills-based immigration model, while not completely closing the door to family reunification on grounds of humanity. There is, however, no justification for cutting legal immigration by 50%. The fact that the Trump White House is so eager to push this plan exposes the real agenda of anti-immigration activists. They claim to be opposing illegal immigration only, but it is clear they want to vastly reduce legal immigration, too. And while justifying these cutbacks on economic grounds, it's hard not to suspect that their agenda is actually cultural and ethnic. There are some in Stephen Miller's camp who are eager to reverse what they see as dangerous demographic trends. They should expound their xenophobic agenda more honestly rather than hiding behind specious economic claims. The hypocrisy is all the more astounding, given that President Trump is once again bringing in foreign guest workers to staff Mar-a-Lago, and Jared Kushner's family company is being investigated for selling visas to wealthy Chinese. The White House message seems to be that foreign workers are good for the Trump family's business, but not for the country as a whole. The incurious political reporter. When I was working in political public relations under the late, great Jim Vlasto, one of the first things he taught me was that, while it's not always the case, the way to bet is that political reporters are both ignorant and lazy. Yesterday, Jim Acosta of CNN showed exactly what Jim Vlasto meant. Outraged at the new immigration proposal Trump announced yesterday, Acosta took on the White House's Stephen Miller and got his head handed to him, largely because Acosta was long on liberal moral arrogance and very short on the facts. Acosta essentially made 2 points. One was that the proposed legislation that Miller was defending did not square with the poem by Emma Lazarus, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Miller pointed out that, great as the poem is, it is not part of the Constitution. Furthermore, the circumstances of 1883, when it was written, are perhaps no longer pertinent in the early 21st century, and we might need new legislation to deal with that reality. Acosta's other point was that the legislation would require immigrants to know English before they could get a green card. He apparently didn't know that current law requires the very same thing. He could have looked it up in a few seconds on Wikipedia, but, as Jim Vlasto said, political reporters tend to be lazy. Acosta then said that that requirement would mean that only immigrants from Britain and Australia could get in. Perhaps HES never heard of Canada, where practically all its 35 million citizens, including French Canadians, can speak English. While Mandarin Chinese has the most native speakers, with around 900 million, English is third with about 371 million. But Mandarin is spoken almost entirely in northern China. English is either the official or unofficial language in no fewer than 52 different countries around the world. The sun may have set on the British Empire, but the sun never sets on the English language. English is, by far, the dominant second language in the world. No fewer than 611 million speak it as a second tongue. In polyglot India, the parliament debates in English because it's every Indian's second language. Commercial aviation has only one language, used throughout the world, and that language is English. The English language is the overwhelmingly dominant language of science. Most scientific journals now come out, at least at first, in English, even that of France's leading scientific institute, the Institut Pasteur. Major scientific conferences are always held in English. In Europe, English is, again by a very wide margin, the most studied foreign language. 73% of primary students in European schools are studying English. Fully 90% of European secondary students are studying English. The reason is that non-English speaking countries realize that in the modern global economy, knowing English is just as important as math and reading and writing in the local tongue. This all means that most applicants for green cards, most of them highly skilled, whether they come from Europe, Asia, or elsewhere, will already be competent in English. Policymakers know that. Political reporters, apparently, don't.